there's a combination of factors here where it's understanding how you learn as an individual, but also finding an area. Like if you are seeking an area of study, an area of work, I always say if you have an interest in it, that's half the battle when it comes to doing well at it. And doing well at it also means, again, going back to the memory piece, how much do you remember? Hello and welcome. We're so glad you're tuning into the Taking Good Care show. I'm Dr. Andrew Wong, based in Toronto, Canada.
And I'm Dr. David St. Arno, based in Edmonton, Canada. We're two practicing psychologists with over a decade of experience each, working in a variety of settings and supporting diverse populations.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. While we're both practicing psychologists, our podcast is intended purely for educational and entertainment purposes. It's not a substitute for professional mental health care or treatment. If you're in need of support, we strongly encourage you to reach out to a licensed mental health professional in your area.
Good morning, Andrew.
Good afternoon, Dave. Still morning there, afternoon here. Just hit a little bit past noon here.
So we got a big day. We're going to record in the morning. We're our morning here, and then I got some clients, and then we're going to be having a guest on. So I'm pretty excited. Today's a nice full day of a bit of practical work in my office and a
Yeah.
bit of like talking about things on the podcast. So, and
And
it's
it sounds
Friday.
like, yeah, it's Friday. I think we're both ending our weeks off with our guest later in the second recording that we're going to do today. So it could be a nice way to finish up for the week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And today's part two of memory. So, this is something that, again, it might not be the focus of my work in my office, but it is a concern that a lot of people express, right? A lot of people worry about their memory, and I think, rightfully so. I've heard it described before as like we are the sum of our memories, right? And if you think about it like that, if you start to lose memory or are worried about your memory, it can be really upsetting and a loss of identity potential. So,
Oh,
and
for
if you know
sure.
someone with dementia or Alzheimer's, then that might be front of your mind and a real concern because it is quite a horrible disease, right? And that'll be part three. So we're not going to get into that today, but
Yeah.
it's going to be more on memory strategies today.
Yep. And I think memory is so pervasive in our lives, right? We rely on it. If we didn't have a memory, I mean, I don't know how this world would function, right? And as we talked about in a previous episode when we spoke about assessments and testing, here in Ontario, when we work with students of all ages, memory is something that we do test for. How good are they at encoding and processing and recalling verbal information and visual information? Is there a difference between the two? And it really does impact academic performance, right? Students who can sit there and just make really strong associations and really strong encoding into their memory, fast processing of new information, often also means that they are remembering more of what is being said, what is being taught. And then the second piece of that is also the recall of that information. How fast are they recalling that information? Do they need additional time to recall that information? So, in so many aspects of our lives, our work lives, school lives, we do rely on our memory very much.
Yeah, I was just going to say that too, like the learning and memory, right? They kind of go together. Like
Mhm.
in order to learn something, we have to recall it. We have to at least, whether it's conscious or unconscious, but there has to be some kind of remembering of the task or the information. And so they're so intertwined. If we lose our memory, we kind of lose our ability to learn new things, right?
Yep.
So,
And even when we think about more primitive species, let's think of even just household pets, right? Dogs and cats, and it's very obvious that they have memory as well, right? When it comes to learning and memory, this is why, if you have a pet, a dog at home, they're probably way friendlier with you than they may be with other people because they see you as part of the family and you see them as part of the family. right? But that's because they remember you,
Yeah,
right?
or they remember your smell, or they remember
Exactly.
the sound of your voice, or there's cues that yeah. And we talked about this in the first episode, so we're not going to review all of that stuff again, but I will just review quickly like the memory process like you were talking about. Like there's input, there's a stimulus, there's something in our environment, and then we hold it or we work through it or we process it a bit in short-term memory, working memory. And then if it makes it into our long-term storage, then some of the information then gets stored in our long-term memory. And then we have the ability to recall that information later on, right? That is kind of and you can have issues or challenges in each of those areas.
And I think this is where, again, going back to neuropsychology, going back to specialist neurology and so on, becomes very important. They're the ones who can sort of decipher all the different types of memories, different areas of the brain that may be struggling and having challenges. And that's not what we do.
No,
Um,
no.
so we won't talk about
No,
that.
there are specializations that will specialize more in this area. We're giving a broad overview, like you were saying pre-recording. This is like Psych 101 for those that have taken like undergrad psychology courses. This is pretty common knowledge, but also, not that common knowledge. So one of the, we'll do what we normally do and demystify some things, some misunderstandings and clarify some things. And one of them is that our memory is, it's reconstructive. It's not recording like a video or a photograph, even though we put a lot of weight on eyewitness testimony or our memory of like what actually happened when we're having an argument, right? But really understanding that our memory is a reconstruction of the events or of the information, and that every time we remember something we actually change the memory a bit. So those are super important things to remember that a lot of people don't know or put the appropriate amount of emphasis on it, that our memory is actually quite weak and we forget a lot of things.
So last time we did talk about, all the different kinds of memories. And today, I think going back to the work that I do, a lot of it is focused on students, children, adolescents, and schooling. We thought we would talk more about strategies. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, do you want to dive right into the strategies right now?
Yeah, I think before we get into the strategies, perhaps even talking just a tiny bit about some of the challenges that we sometimes see in the school system, if that's okay.
Maybe even just before that,
Yeah.
and this is super quick, but looking at, we talked about how the input and processing, storage and retrieval or recall, the things that will affect all those processes are like
Hmm.
attention, right? And you'll probably get into a bit of that, but what we attend to, and then how interesting something is, or how kind of
Sure.
meaningful or relevant it is to us and our past knowledge, and emotional connection to the material or to the events. So those are factors that are going to influence all of the ability to do those other basic memory things.
Well, I think you bring up a really good point, Dave. Our emotional attachment and how engaged we are. What is our intrinsic interest into something? Right. So a very simple example is, if you have a student who is really interested in mathematics and is really strong in mathematics, but they have no interest or very little interest in the languages,
Yeah.
right? When the teacher is teaching math at the front of the class, or maybe they're in high school and they go to math class, everything just clicks for them, right? And so when the teacher's teaching, everything's being encoded well, they are engaged, they are participating. And then when they go to language class, maybe it's English or French or whatever it is, and they're just like zoned out, 50% of the brain is sort of engaged. So just in terms of that emotional connection, that engagement with the material, that already has an impact on how you're going to do in the class.
For sure. Yeah, actually, as you're talking, I have an example that just this week my oldest son's in a soccer camp and he's with a friend. And so what they're doing is soccer camp in the morning, and then my son hangs out with his friend for a while, and then I pick him up from the his friend's place. And his friend is really into watching the World Cup right now and loves watching soccer and is interested in the players and all about it, right? And my son could care less. Like he went over on the first day that the friend wanted to watch one of the World Cup games, and my son was like, "This is not a play date, right? This is not we're not playing anything. We're not just going to sit and watch." Like, so he is not interested. So he doesn't know any of the players' names. He doesn't know the teams. And this other kid could recite all of these players from these teams, right? So how interested you are in something, they could both be watching the same game, and one will retain a lot more of what happened in the game, who the players are, what the calls were. And my son's probably thinking about something he wants to do rather than watching the game and will not retain much of it at all.
Yeah. So that's exactly it, right? Like it's again very pervasive throughout our lives. It doesn't just have to do with school,
No.
right?
Yeah.
I remember my mom saying, even when I was little, it's like, how come you can't remember this stuff from school, but you can remember all these statistics about sports and the Blue Jays and all this stuff? It's like, to this
Yeah.
day, it's very much the same. If I'm watching sports, I hear stuff from the commentators, various facts and stuff, or I read about it. It just seems to click with me. Like, I don't know why. Maybe even more so than the psychology stuff.
Well, and you know what, even for parents or for other people listening, like that is a great point. If you can remember certain things about certain topics, it means that kind of the hardware to be able to
Hmm.
memorize and to learn things is there. And if you, then maybe it's another factor like interest or motivation or meaning. Those are the things that you might kind of look at in terms of explaining why someone has a difficulty remembering, say, math or social study, history, information.
Absolutely.
One more thing I was going to say too, though, is thinking about this episode and thinking about our memory and how like our brain tries to choose or decide what gets into long-term memory and how long it's stored there for,
Hmm.
right? And I was thinking about all the technology that we have now. Like we can wear meta glasses, we can wear, we could really wear like a GoPro and record our entire life, right? But how useful would that be? Right? Not very useful. If we had every minute of our life recorded, right? It's like taking those photos and you take 1,000 photos and then you don't look at any of them, right? So our brain is actually quite sophisticated in terms of trying to decide what is important to remember because we have a limited memory, like we have a limited capacity to store or to even hold information in our
Hmm.
working memory. So just like a computer, if you have limited storage and you try to record everything, it's not going to work very well. So I think it's kind of neat, right? That even if we have the capacity to do it, it might not be useful to remember every single thing, right?
Yeah, our brain has a filter to figure out, okay, what's important and what's not important. Just like in school, when you are reading a passage, when you're reading a story, a novel, you're not remembering that novel word for word. It's impossible, right? From page 100 to page 300 to remember that word for word. But what our brain is doing is filtering and summarizing constantly, right? Every paragraph that you read, every chapter that you read, it's sort of like making mental bullet points, for that individual reading it, what were the important points? And let's say you and I are reading the same book, Dave, what's important to you may be different for what's important to me. And so
Yeah.
our memory will filter that out. And this is what's interesting in the school system is that there's almost like a template of what the teacher or the educators want you to remember, right? And so you're almost like forcing your brain to remember certain things that honestly you could probably care less about, but because for a lot of the students, for many students, they know that okay, I want to do well in school, so I better remember this stuff. And you sort of force it into your brain. But it doesn't mean that over time that information will decay. right? That
Hmm.
memory decay. And I use the analogy of like Swiss cheese, right? So Swiss cheese has holes in it, and as time goes on, some of the things that you learned will fall through the holes. Other things will be caught, but other things will also fall through. And so when you're trying to recall things from, let's say, like 3 years ago, you may remember some of the details, but not all of the details. And so as you're telling a story to somebody, you might say, "Oh, like I remember this sort of happened, and I think it was in July, or maybe it was May or June. I really don't remember that part." But then they remember like the meat and potatoes of the story,
Hmm.
right? But they forget some of the details, like the minute details.
Yeah. And so when you're learning in school, right, one of the strategies is to connect it to something that's meaningful to you or to create
Hmm.
a story around it that is like connected to something that's interesting for you. And
Yeah,
so captivating students' interests, right? The good teachers will do that. They'll make it exciting or interesting because some of the information is really just, not that interesting. It's strictly information. And so there's different strategies that you can
yeah,
use, but that as you're talking, it was like, oh yeah, of course, that is one that I've used so many times. Like, how can I make this connected to something I already know or that is like meaningful to me?
yeah. Well, I think that's why when I advise parents, and their student is struggling in school, and not just with memory, just in general, it's requesting or finding a teacher who teaches in a multimodal method, right? So it's not just lecturing at the front of the class and expecting students to learn verbally, right? To encode effectively and efficiently, some students are, for example, more kinesthetic learners, right? So by doing it, they'll remember, right?
Hmm.
Sure, there are other students who are more auditory or verbal learners. So, as you're talking, they can process that information and organize it in the brain very efficiently.
Hmm.
And then other students are visual learners, right? So being able to see diagrams, right? Not just talking about the water cycle, it's actually seeing the water cycle in action,
Hmm.
right? Or making some sort of model to depict the water cycle, right? So now they're working with their hands. That, multimodal method of teaching is going to help students, various students, remember the content.
Absolutely. Yeah. You make me think of I did a workshop for university instructors, like using AI.
Yep.
And one of the workshop guests was showing a video that they made, and it was using the theme of The Matrix, right, with like Keanu Reeves, but it wasn't Keanu Reeves. But the most people are familiar with that movie, like as a university student, right? It's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that's something they already know. And then he made it like explain a concept, a complicated concept using these characters. And so it was like, oh, this is really neat. And this would have taken like hours and weeks to do. But with AI, he was saying, I can do this in about an hour or two, right? Like I can
Yeah.
take a complicated topic and make it more accessible and visual than
Yep.
I would have been able to before. And so we have more and more technology to make things more multimodal, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the other piece that can be really helpful is like using certain analogies, right? And I know we like to use analogies even through some of the things we talk about in the podcast. But when a teacher, an instructor is able to use something that is so relevant to students,
Hmm.
their interests, whether it's the current movie or Taylor Swift or whatever. And, if they can use a certain analogy that clicks with the students, again, that's going to really reinforce the information that they're teaching because you're making it relevant to their lives.
Hmm. Oh, we could just keep going with strategies now because I was like thinking, like making it a game, right? Making it competitive.
Yep.
And so even if it's strictly like learning vocabulary, right? And
Yep.
having flashcards, but making it a competition, splitting the class up or breaking up into
Yep.
groups and
Well, I think the most basic things that we think about when it comes to memory is rehearsal. So I think this is what parents and teachers harp on all the time. Or what the majority of the population thinks of as studying,
Yeah.
right? So many high school students I work with, it's like, did you study for that test? Yeah, I did. How did you study for the test? I flipped through my notes. It's like, did you pick up a pen and paper at all and do the math questions? No, I just flipped through the notes, right? And so, yes, for some topics perhaps, and for some students, rehearsal is this idea of just repeating and repeating. Just look over it again, say things to yourself again over and over. It can be helpful for certain things. Usually it's like for simple things like phone numbers, maybe like a grocery list, and you repeat that grocery list 5 times to yourself and reinforce it on the way to the grocery store. But for more challenging things, whether it's university content, high school content, knowledge, rehearsal becomes much more challenging of a strategy to use.
Yeah, and if there's more information. But again, with flashcards, using like sight words to memorize the sound of words without having to like phonetically pronounce like like read them out, right? So if
Hmm.
you can learn about 1,000 popular sight words that are common in whatever language you're studying, then that frees up your mental load to be able to work on the new words or the novel thing words that you're not familiar with. But that means, every day, maybe looking at 5 flashcards and then testing yourself on them, right? So practicing that, not only seeing them, but rehearsing, retrieving them,
Yep.
right?
Yep. And I think with flashcards, that's another point that you bring up, Dave, is the organization, right? Typically, the more organized we are, the more successful we'll be in recalling information effectively and efficiently. Right. So again, if you're just scrolling through your notes, right, whether it's on the computer, turning the pages, nothing's really organized in the way that works for you. The way it's organized, perhaps the way you copy down the notes or the way the PowerPoint slides are arranged, is efficient and effective for the instructor, right? But not necessarily for you. So if you have an instructor who's actually quite disorganized, your studying, if you're just scrolling through notes or flipping through pages, is probably going to be disorganized as well. But if you pick up a piece of paper, a pen, or even on your computer or making flashcards, you can actually organize the information in a way that works for you, right? So let's say you're studying something about, I don't know, geography, right? And you're studying about every single continent and maybe some specific things about each continent. Maybe your teacher jumped around from one continent to the other. But by reorganizing, let's say using flashcards or reorganizing your notes or making now bullet points of important things that I should remember, you can categorize it, right? So now you can talk about all the things in Asia first and make flashcards only about Asia, right? And then you master Asia and then you move on to North America, right? So this idea of being able to organize, and in a way, by reorganizing, you're also reviewing material. Okay,
Hmm.
so you're using rehearsal and organization at the same time.
Well, and I think you're highlighting something that the brain does, right? Like our brain tries to organize things. And I often, even when I'm working with counseling clients, I'll say, oh, like that file just opened up. Like that file of being hurt or that
Hmm.
file of being betrayed, right? So like this is really important because we have free recall where we try to just remember something freely, but
Right.
most of our memory, I'd say, is like cued recall. So like your earlier example of like at this age, what do you remember? Or someone might say, I don't remember anything from being about 5 to 7.
Yep.
But then you show them a picture of them at 5 or 7 and they were at a park or they were camping or they were doing something, and it's like, oh, that whole file opens up. It's actually stored in there. They have the memory. They just weren't able to retrieve it. So again, the way we organize information will also help with the way we retrieve it. Because if we remember one thing from that category, we might then be able to remember all the things about Asia that we learned,
Yep.
right?
Yep. And Part of organizing too sort of leads into another strategy called chunking, right? So by chunking information, I sort of gave an example of it already, study one continent first and then study the next one instead of trying to cram every single continent that you're trying to learn into one evening, right? So chunking the information often does help with memory recall too.
Well, and I think I mentioned it in the other one, but chunking numbers, like just instead of trying to remember four discrete numbers, and you could remember it as like 1986, right? Oh, that's a time where I was 4 years old. And so now you've paired that with something that's relevant and meaningful and already in your memory,
Yeah.
rather than remembering 1986, which is harder for our brain to do.
The other one I want to touch on is what we would call mnemonic devices,
Hmm.
which really, I guess the word mnemonic is a very abstract word. But this really talks about memory aids or sort of cognitive devices, I guess, when we talk about like using acronyms or turning information into a rhyme or a song, right? Or using visual images to remember certain pieces of information. So an acronym is, let's say you're going to use the first letter of a word to recall, for example, the Great Lakes in North America, right? So one could be Holmes, so Homes, so Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior, right? And that's the one my children learned actually in school, but I always say I have a better one. So Superman helps everyone because that one will help you locate the Great Lakes from west to east, right? So that's another kind of mnemonic. So every first letter of the words that I just said, Superman helps everyone, is the first letter of the lakes as well. And it goes from west to east. My children disagree, but
But again, like I like that because if you know one of the lakes starts with one of those letters, you can probably find it, right? Like
yes.
that's how it helps cue your recall.
Yeah, so using acronyms now, again, I think staying organized is really important because let's say you're trying to study for, I remember very specifically, I think it was a neuropsych course, a neuropsychology course, and I was trying to make acronyms for everything
Mhm.
because of all the different brain areas, the brain regions and its functions and all of that.
Yeah.
And I started getting confused with all the different acronyms. Like I had to find a different way because my brain was getting overloaded with acronyms.
Yeah. For sure. Again, you're speaking to like cognitive load and you know we actually have a quite limited ability to work with things in our working memory and to recall things. So the more we can chunk it or group it together, the better off. So if all of your mnemonic devices were like related to a specific topic, maybe that would help, right? But at some point too, we just can't keep adding more, right? Without possibly losing something. And another important point is that, you know, old memories affect new memories and new memories affect old memories. So sometimes learning something new can interfere with being able to recall something old or the other way around, right? And so it can be frustrating because it was like, oh, I worked so hard to remember this, and now because I've learned this, I forget that.
Yeah. And also too, our memories can trick us as well. Right? Our memories can trick us. So, there's this whole area of study around false memories. And so you think you heard something, but you really didn't. Or there's some really classic psychology studies of like who did the crime and, people being interrogated and memories are sort of implanted and to the point where the person believes that something actually did happen when it really didn't. So it's a really fascinating area of study.
Oh, we could do a whole episode on that. It's actually quite controversial too, right? Because when someone is pressing charges for something that happened a long time ago,
Yep.
right? There has been lawyers that have argued that like false memory claim, right? And we actually know from research that we can make false memories, like the study of being lost in the mall and you ask the child, like, do you remember being lost in the mall when you were, 4 years old? And this child says no. But then adding more details, it's like, oh, your mom was looking for you, and then she finally found you with this guy. And then the child starts to go, oh, yeah, I remember that. And then they start adding details, right? And then you ask them a month later, and they remember it as if it what really happened when we know that it actually did not happen. So again, I always have a lot of caution. Like I think I mean, most of therapy is based off of memory, right? We're asking people like, how was your week? How was your childhood? How was like, and you have to actually remember things, right? And to know that our memory is actually quite unreliable at times.
That's why when I work with kids and teenagers, if I'm able to, I will talk to parents too, just to ensure that the recall of that week is accurate.
Mhm.
And I would say 50% of the time, it's quite a different interpretation of how the week went.
Of course, right? And different people are going to have different memories of those that same week, right?
Yep,
And so what might be important to the parents might not be important to the child. And
exactly.
what might be important
Exactly.
for you as a psychologist might be different, right? So,
Back to our strategies, another piece I wanted to really talk about and highlight its importance is this idea of spaced repetition. So many times we are trying to cram for a test, for an exam, or I guess students who say, I'll just study the day before and I'll be fine. And I think for some subjects, and maybe depending on some of the way the assessments are run in high school, yeah, you can probably get away with 1 to 2 days of studying, maybe even just one day. But as content and concepts become more complex, and this is sort of like uh, the falsehood, I guess, of what people think of going to university or even college is like, where they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I did great in high school, and I'll be able to do this again in university and just study the way I've been studying." And more often than not, they come back and say, "Oh my gosh, like my marks have dropped this much, and this is so much harder," and panic sets in. But when you ask them, how have you been studying? They haven't changed. They haven't figured out that I need to study differently now, right? It's a different ball game in post-secondary education. And so not just cramming in the last night before an exam. I'm sure you and I have done it at some point, but being able to space it out over the course of a week or two, or intermittently reviewing material throughout the course of the semester, right? Ideally, that is what we would be doing.
I know you've mentioned this before, and silently in my head, I'm like, oh man, if you only knew. Like, I've all through my studies, all through grad studies, even the hardest courses, most of my studying was cramming. Like, because there is a window where it's still kind of fresh and
Sure.
recall is a bit easier. So I've pulled like all-nighters and read like 4 chapters and made notes, and other people would be like, that is terrible. Like that would not work for me, right? Like so different people are going to have different things that they'll be able to do. And what actually helped me would stress someone else out and was not a good way to do it. I do know that like what you're saying is true, that if I had more time and I spaced it out, I would actually recall it for a longer period of time. And depending on the course too, how like whether it's straight memorization and recall, or whether it's actually like you have to think through the concepts or apply the material, that matters too. But yeah, I'm just disclosing that, I've done really well on really hard exams and have spent 2 days. Even like my e- even my licensing exam, that
Oh
it's
man.
yeah, oh man, like this is the most comprehensive, massive exam that I've ever studied for. And I basically spent 2 weeks nonstop studying, and learning the material. Like some of the material I already knew, right? So it's not fair. Like I was teaching some courses that were covered in the
Oh, that's good.
exam. Yeah, so
That's good.
it wasn't completely starting from nothing, but most people take about, 3 to 6 months to study for this exam, and they're
Yeah.
chunking it and they're breaking it up over time. And yeah, I was two
Yep.
weeks and I'm like, if I pass it, I pass it. If I fail it, I'll rewrite it. Like that's going to be my strategy because I can't spend more time on this right now. And the
Yeah.
quicker I would pass the exam, the quicker I could be registered. So yeah, not recommended. It's not great for mental health and overall well-being.
The stress
Um,
levels.
but accomplishing a goal, possibly, right? And yeah.
You know what? I think if I mean that's the way you study and it works, that's great. I think for me, I didn't realize what I needed probably until my third year of university when I again more deliberately organized my time better, got things done well ahead of deadlines and I sort of avoided cramming at that point. You know, the first couple of years was constant cramming. But I think what was really reinforcing for me was that I saw the results,
Mhm.
right? It's like, oh, okay. So I don't know what initiated me to change things up. I don't know. Maybe I wanted better grades. I don't know. But I was like, I'm gonna try something different. When the prof assigns a paper, I'm just gonna write it well ahead of the deadline, and just do it. And it started to work, and I saw the payoff was better grades, better and better grades.
Yeah.
So, it worked for me, and I just sort of stumbled upon it that it wasn't, like I said, until third year of university. Did I wish that it maybe happened earlier? Absolutely. But it was in my time, and I've sort of found, okay, this is what I need to do.
I think that's so important. And I mean, that's with life in general, but finding out what works for you. And so these are going to be strategies that are shown to be effective in the research, right? Like we're talking about things that are documented as like effective strategies for memory, but then tailoring it to your own style, that things that work best for you and when maybe it won't work so well. And so even thinking about what I said, like this was years of trial and error and figuring out it wasn't strictly like just cramming. It was cramming a certain way. Like I would actually be reading the textbook, making notes about vocabulary. I always had two lists of notes. One was strictly vocabulary, so I knew the meaning of the words, or at least could recall it when I saw it. And then the other one was concepts or like events, right, that were more complicated that I needed to recall. So I was actively making notes while cramming, studying, if you want to call it that, and being able to organize it like we talked about already, right? In a certain way. So on the surface, it would be like, oh, well, you crammed and it didn't work for you and it worked for you. But like it's more complicated than just saying, I tried to learn all of this information in a short amount of time. It's like, well, how did you actually try to encode it and recall it?
So I think it's very individualistic, right? Like, and there's a combination of factors here where it's understanding how you learn as an individual, but also finding an area. Like if you are seeking an area of interest, an area of study, an area of work, I always say if you have an interest in it, that's half the battle when it comes to doing well at it. And doing well at it also means, again, going back to the memory piece, how much do you remember, right? If you're going to becoming an electrician, for example, right? If you are genuinely interested in that work, when you're sitting in class, when you are out in the field doing a co-op placement or doing a work placement, you're more likely to remember it because you already have an intrinsic interest in that particular area,
Hmm.
right? And then for things that, if you find that sometimes it's harder for you to remember certain things, it's using certain strategies. It could be a strategy that we talked about today or something that you came up with yourself. Right. Like one strategy that I'll disclose that I use. I don't even think that there's a term for this. Maybe it's visualization. I don't know. But for example, the fridge in our house is really soft close. It's effective, but it's so soft close. Sometimes I don't even know if it closes properly. Right. And I don't want to come back at the end of the workday with a malfunctioning fridge. So in the mornings when I leave the house, I will deliberately give the doors just another nudge or push, right? But I might take a split second and just hold my hand there and just remember I did this. So that come midday, let's say it's like middle of the day and I go, "Oh, did I close the fridge properly today?" I'll remember, yes, I did because I remember standing there just for that extra split second that I nudged it a little further shut.
Well, yeah, and I mean, this is more complicated than even you're alluding to. I think when we do things automatically, it frees up our memory and our cognitive abilities to think about other things. So, locking your door or closing your fridge or locking your vehicle or like some of these things that we've automatically trained ourselves to do, we can be like, did I do it? I don't know. I have no recall of actually doing it. So you're adding an extra strategy to something that you regularly would question yourself about because it is so automatic that,
Yeah.
yeah.
So anything else to add, Dave?
Well, I would just want to highlight that, like, gold standard is spaced repetition, like you're saying. So space it out, repeat it over time, and then adding to that is active recall. So, you know, you just read something or you just learned a new word, and then you close the book and you say, what is the meaning of that word? Right? And you recall it, and then you do that over and over again, and you space that out, you are going to remember things a lot better, right? So you could walk away from the fridge and go, did I close the fridge? Right? As an active recall and keep practicing that. And ideally, you get to a point where that just, there is no doubt in your mind that you locked your front door, right? But if you were distracted, like,
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah, yeah.
if you're walking your dog or you're taking the kids out of the house and one of them falls down the stairs or one of them runs out and you have to attend to it, there's a chance that your regular routine gets thrown off and then you didn't do the thing that you normally do and you don't really remember it either.
I think this reminds me of a really important, I guess, way of remembering things is doing it with intention,
Hmm.
is really doing some things with intention. If you think it's important, try to just focus on that rather than being distracted by other things. Because to your point, I can be closing the fridge, but if I'm rushing out the door or my kids are screaming, outside and I have to go attend to them as well, I'm
Hmm.
not going to remember that I gave it that extra nudge.
No.
Right. And I think this is very important, even when we think about studying. Actually, I just spoke to a student yesterday about this. If the home is really chaotic, very loud, lots of other siblings around, half the time those siblings are coming into your room and bugging you every 15 minutes, the brain is actually using a lot more resources to start and stop that studying, right?
Hmm.
But if you can take an hour of just intentional studying and not having to think about what's happening in the background, you're more likely to remember and learn what you're trying to learn more effectively.
Yeah. So not having the TV playing or, something else that is going to pull your attention away from what you're trying to attend to, right?
Mhm.
And so even, I'd say a minimum 20 minute, like a solid 20 minutes. If you get shorter than that, you're going to be kind of multitasking or doing too many things and it's going to be harder. And like you said, if you can do an hour, great, but at least chunks of 20 minutes before taking a break or doing something else and then returning to the material, especially studying for like school stuff, right?
Yep, exactly. So, a lot of different tidbits, I think, in this episode.
Can I say one more before I
Yeah,
lose it?
absolutely. Yeah, 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 go for it.
Because it's popped into my memory a couple of times as you were talking, and it might come back later, but I got it now. So, as we're talking about memory, one of the things, like you were saying, studying in your room and having, other siblings or other distractions in the house, one of the things through the research that they've found over and over again, what helps recall is actually recalling in the place that you encoded it. So, actually, if it's possible, studying for the exam in the place where you're going to write the exam versus studying, in some other place. Because if you go back to your room after the exam and that's where you did all your studying, you might be like, oh, now I remember the answer to that question, right? And that is scientifically proven to be the case, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
There you go. I think we left listeners with a number of different strategies. And again, this is not an exhaustive list by all means. If you have your own and it works for you, use it. But I think for anyone who is looking for maybe a couple different strategies and trying to learn more about their own memory functioning, hopefully you got something out of this today.
for sure. And maybe rather than a summary, I'm going to add one more thing because I think it's super important. Stress levels affect recall. So,
Yes.
what I was mentioning about cramming, I know that when I would join a group right before an exam, we'd meet like outside where we were going to be writing the exam, and I was still cramming material. That would stress out other people. Like they wanted to get a good night's sleep. They wanted to just, not look at any of the material right before the exam because it would
Hmm.
increase their stress. And now that I know
Yes.
this, I didn't know this at the time, but the stress would impair their recall and affect, they would actually do worse on the exam under that stress, right? So, doing things for yourself, like working out, sleeping, eating a good breakfast, whatever it is that helps you kind of relax and not be super stressed, is actually going to help you recall the information you're trying to recall. So,
Man, you know what killed me in university is like when you walk before an exam, close to the examination hall or classroom and people are still flipping notes or they're talking about stuff. I always just put in my headphones.
oh, that was me. I was the guy, like the textbook was still open. I had my notes. I was walking into the exam up until they said, "Okay, put everything away." That that was me. So we would not have been a good study pair.
No, I just usually had a hoodie, put in my headphones, and just blocked the sound out. I couldn't. Talking about stress and recall.
Yeah, like I would have people be like, "Please, like can you not do that around me because
Oh,
this is
really?
not helpful." Because I would be like, "Do you guys know this and remember this one?" And like, yeah, I was not making friends with the people like you right before the exam. So,
Oh, I wouldn't have been that mean.
oh.
I would have tried to help. I wouldn't have told you to stop doing
Well, you're too nice. So,
that.
all right, this was fun again. Yeah. So, hopefully, yeah, like you said, the listeners got something out of this, maybe some tidbits here and there. This is not exhaustive. There's a lot of great information out there. And if you like this and you think someone else might like it, hit subscribe, follow. Those things really help kind of the podcast grow and get out to the people that might benefit from it. So, we appreciate that if you're doing that for us. And until next time. Take good care.
Take good. Oh, we were almost in unison there. Take good
Yeah.
care, everyone.